Now, at the same time that the Islamic philosophers were dealing with the ideas of Aristotle and metaphysics, the guys in the West were also dealing with similar ideas, and the guys who were doing this were known as the Schoolmen. Now, these guys were kind of the successors of the Carolingian court, so you remember the guys like Origena, who we discussed earlier, who'd been invited by the king to come to the court. Well, the court itself had kind of died out a few years ago from AD 1000 because the successors of Charlemagne divided the land up between his sons, and they fragmented into states which would go on to become France and Germany. So there wasn't kind of a central authority in the West anymore. However, Charlemagne had made one big success, which was standardising Latin to some extent, which enabled churchmen to converse across borders and set up schools. And most of the modern states of Western Europe were taking shape at this time. In England, you had Alfred the Great's successor, Athelstan, around 800, uniting the fragmented Saxon and Viking kingdoms into something resembling modern England. Spain, of course, was in the hands of the Moors as Al-Andalus, while Italy was divided between the warlords and the papacy, and most of modern France had been set up by Charlemagne himself. Now, the schoolmen were mostly churchmen, and much of their concern was with reconciling faith and reason, as we discussed before, but also with logic, because Aristotle and these new ideas that were starting to come out of the Islamic world were often focused on logic. I don't think it's very appropriate to focus on logic too much here, because logic's kind of hard to explain orally. I find it much easier if it's written down, so if you want to study the schoolmen's logic, then feel free to do so yourself. So the most famous of the early schoolmen were three: Anselm, Abelard and Aquinas, although we'll deal with Aquinas in a later chapter. Now, Anselm became Archbishop of Canterbury, and he's most famous for the ontological argument for God. And the paraphrased argument runs as follows. This is an argument from being. So, if you start off, the first thing you've got to do is imagine the greatest thing imaginable. Now, the second thing is to note that the greatest thing imaginable could exist either in reality or just in the mind. And the third assumption is that something does not exist in reality. It would be possible to imagine something greater. Now, therefore, you get a logical contradiction if it doesn't exist in reality, and therefore, it must be real. And there's two assumptions in this argument which seem to be faulty and have been criticised by later authors. One of these is that existing is greater than not existing, and this is an assumption that's made. It's debatable how true this is. I mean, is it more impressive if you made the whole world and existed, or if you did all that and it didn't even exist? And another is this idea of greatness in all attributes, in terms of being the greatest thing imaginable, is coherent. I mean, in certain aspects, there seems to be mutually contradictory properties, and you couldn't be the greatest in both. While this, kind of in terms of good and evil, it's fairly clear-cut that maximal goodness would be one of these, and obviously God would be maximum good rather than maximum evil. In terms of other areas, it's kind of hard to debate which would be the greatest of them. So, moving on from the ontological argument, which are going to have a great impact in subsequent philosophy, moving on from Anselm to Abelard. Now, Abelard was a monk who hung out in northern France, and he's probably more famous for his secret affair with student Eloise and subsequent castration by her angry uncle than his philosophy. They wrote many love letters to each other. You can have a read of them. They're quite famous works of Western literature. He did much important work in logic, but also in ethics, and I think I'd like to focus most on his ethic of intention, because I think that's probably most relevant to the modern day. Now, similar to Augustine, Abelard's view was that it was the mental state of the individual, not an action, that makes something bad. A bad intention might ruin a good act, i.e. publishing someone out of hatred. He did, however, advocate punishment for some criminal acts with no intention, and this focus on intention as kind of deserving of more punishment is reflected in modern criminal law. For example, in England, where you need to have intention, the mens rea, for liability for more severe crimes, such as murder, as opposed to manslaughter, where simply the act is enough, you don't need any intention. And from a practical perspective, this emphasis on intention makes sense. Someone who intends to harm others is generally a greater danger to the community than someone who simply does so out of accident or carelessness.